Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight is the latest in our regular series of public events, the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. I'd like to thank CIGI's public lecture sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for your continuing support. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming out tonight. We had about double this number registered, but I think the thunder showers may have frightened a few people away. But thank you for coming, and thank you to our online webcast audience. Besides the audience here, we do have a global audience watching via the internet. Following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones on either side, or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our panel. Our topic tonight is Beyond 2015, Development Goals for the World. In just a few moments, our moderator will introduce our highly esteemed panel. But first, I'll introduce our moderator, and that is Barry Caron, a senior fellow at CIGI since 2009. Barry has a distinguished career both as an academic and a policy practitioner. With a PhD in economics from Brown University, Barry joined the Treasury Board of Canada in 1971, and aside from a small detour through academia, held various positions in the Federal Civil Service over the next 3 decades, including Assistant Deputy Minister in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and in the mid-1990s holding responsibility for Canadian trade policy, including oversight of challenging international negotiations. Barry has also served as a member of the Executive Committee of the OECD and as the High Commissioner of Canada to Singapore. Today, Barry is an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria, and at CIGI, he's currently co-directing a joint initiative between CIGI and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. The goal of this project is to explore and recommend future directions for international development beyond the 2015 Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, which, as I mentioned, is our topic for tonight. And so, Barry, over to you.
Thanks, Fred. Let me remind you why we're here and how we'll use our time before I introduce the panel. We're here to discuss how should the world approach international development. You all should have a handout, a double-sided handout with basic information on the existing Millennium Development Goals, and on the back of it, there's some status of the progress. And what we're going to talk about is what should succeed those Millennium Development Goals. If you paid attention, we had a looping PowerPoint up top that gave some questions on the existing status of these goals, and I hope you did well on the test. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to begin by asking each panelist 3 questions. I'm going to ask them to respond individually in a one-sentence answer as to whether or not development goals are important. I'm going to ask them to respond in one sentence what, if anything, is wrong with the existing Millennium Development Goals. And then third, I'm going to ask them to each take a few minutes to give us a big picture answer on the assumption that we have a unitary world government. It's a world government of a world federal state, and he or she is the beneficent dictator. They can impose whatever goals they like. They can impose the development goals for the world. What would they do with respect to goals, targets, and indicators? Then we'll take about 30 minutes to explore their answers, and we'll follow with questions and discussions from the floor and with the web-based audience. So we're fortunate today to have a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel. Robert Fowler on the far right is Senior Fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He had a 38-year public service career. He was Foreign Policy Advisor to 3 Prime Ministers, Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Turner, and Prime Minister Mulroney. He was Deputy Minister of National Defense. Bob is our longest-serving ambassador to the United Nations, longer serving than Paul Heinbecker. He represented Canada on the Security Council in 1999 and 2000. He was ambassador to Italy and the 3 Rome-based UN food agencies. And he was Sherpa for the Kananaskis G8 Summit, for which he chaired the creation of the Africa Action Plan. He was the personal representative for Africa of 3 prime ministers, Prime Minister Chrétien, Martin, and Harper. Maureen O'Neill is president of the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation. Her previous positions include president of the IDRC International Development Research Center. She was interim president of the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development. She's been president of the North-South Institute and deputy minister of citizenship for the government of Ontario. Mukesh Kapila is Undersecretary General at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva, and previously he was Special Advisor to the UN in Afghanistan and to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. He has also served as UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in the Sudan. He's had positions at the World Health Organization. He's been a Senior Policy Advisor to the World Bank. Earlier he was Head of Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs at the UK Government Department for International Development. He's also a medical doctor. So let's start with the 3 questions. Bob, in 1 sentence, are development goals important? A 1-sentence answer on what's wrong with the MDGs. And then, Bob, you've finally been appointed as world dictator. What should we do?
So, Mary, you want me to do all of those?
All 3.
Okay. Well, I mean, are they important? Of course, it's important to have some kind of a blueprint for any $120 billion enterprise. So that would be my sentence. My second sentence of 1 would be, it's important that we keep such a blueprint, such a template green, that we revisit it often. But it's very important to remember that, unfortunately, I'm not a world dictator, and therefore what we have in terms of the MDGs are what the nations of the world could agree. And there are all kinds of things that aren't there that I suspect many of us would like to be there, and they're not there because the countries of the world couldn't agree that they had to be there. So it is an exercise of diplomacy, and it's an exercise worse of the United Nations. It's an exercise in the art of the possible. And therefore, that is what we could get. A big discussion, I guess, for us this evening is, as we contemplate the world after 2015, and we talk about either replacing or updating the MDGs, are we likely to get more or less than we did in the year 2000? Is the world more ready to compromise or less? I fear less, and I'm bleeding into your subsequent 2 questions here. I'm not an MDG expert, I'm not a development expert. Maureen and Mukesh are, and I very much look forward to their much more intelligent analysis of what the MDGs are and are not. I find the MDGs vitally important to explain the development business. Development is under a lot of attack these days. As the financial crisis bites, as treasuries are looking for ways to save money, as militaries and foreign ministries are wanting to concentrate available resources to accomplish their geostrategic aims, development tends to get caught in the middle and suffer. So the MDGs help defend the development vocation, and I think that is vital. And I also believe it is extremely important and timely that we get good at defending the development vocation. I have some particular concerns. My concerns are squeaking wheelism. My concerns are that the securocrats will always have a more timely argument for investment in whatever concerns them. I'm worried that failing and failed states will attract the grease, despite the fact that the amount of grease available is not nearly enough to solve the problem in those failing states. I'm worried that in the era of instant gratification, of the 24-hour news cycle, the humanitarian crisis will trump development every time. And therefore, that the very limited amount of money available for real development will be sacrificed to one or other of those more immediate, more dramatic demands. Why don't I leave it there?
Okay. So Maureen, same three questions.
Well, I certainly, first thing I would do would be to change the development goals to global goals. I really think it's important that we include both poor people in the so-called North as well as people in developing countries. I think they are extraordinarily important because they set out what the desired outcomes ought to be of the whole range of social and economic and trade and foreign policy decisions that get made. So it's not just that they're goals, that I see them as the outcomes against which we ought to be judging all of the other policies. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with the current goals, or in my language, the preferred outcomes. The difficulty is in their implementation and also understanding that we should be judging the rest of what we do in terms of its ability to take us closer to the outcomes that we desire. On to the overarching framework post-2015, what should it look like? Now, I'm so literal-minded that when Barry said, imagine yourself a dictator, mind you, a kindly dictator, I may have risen too close to this challenge. So what would I do if I was a kindly dictator? Well, I would ensure, first of all, that the tax base at my disposal, the tribute from the semi-autonomous states, is first used to cost share a long-form census in each state so that they actually have the data to know how they're doing and whether their policies are leading to the better world and to greater respect that the MDGs describe. My taxes would also cost share independent think tanks in the semi-autonomous states, and indeed would cost share tertiary education, independent universities, not just primary schools. Those semi-autonomous states may not have kindly dictators like myself, so independent and brave voices will be necessary to put the spotlight on inequalities and abuse of rights. Yes, rights. My federation already has an already established body of law that sets out rights. The Convention on Social and Economic Rights, Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention which lays out the path to women's equality, CEDAW, the Convention on Rights of the Child. I could go on. As long as I'm dictator, I'll require my semi-autonomous states to turn their attention to implementation. That's where we fall down. And we already have other key institutions on the security side. And we have the International Criminal Court. But my semi-autonomous states must believe in these institutions as much as my polling suggests their citizens do. But what I haven't figured out yet is an equalization program rather like Canada's, to ensure that citizens in the semi-autonomous states have anything resembling like a fair starting point. So-called development programming is a far cry from that, so I'll need your ideas on that. One minister in one of my semi-autonomous states has just told his people what this might look like, and it bears looking at because he's gone so much further than the government of the semi-autonomous state in which we find ourselves tonight. And here I commend to you, I must commend to you, the statement of Andrew Mitchell, the Secretary of State for International Development in the UK, in which not only has he responded to the massive review of bilateral, multilateral aid in his semi-autonomous state, but he's recommitted himself to 0.7% of GNP and is moving briskly along to address squarely issues of women's poverty and women's lack of choice in the number of children they have. So some semi-autonomous states seem to have got the message more clearly, and they are acting on it more strongly than others. So even kindly dictators can't make it all happen.
Okay, Mukesh, in one sentence, are development goals important? In one sentence. what's wrong with them, and then again take a few minutes as you're the beneficent dictator in a unitary world government of semi-autonomous provinces or semi-autonomous states. Your word is law.
Are development goals important? Yeah, but that doesn't make them good. I mean, I might have got hijacked on the way from Toronto airport to here. That hijacking event would be very important, but it wouldn't be a very pleasant experience. So to say that development goals are important is, I think, not the same thing as that is what the world needs, or that an important concept is necessarily a good concept. So it is not to say that the development goals have not been good, but it doesn't mean that the goals we set for tomorrow are necessarily going to be good automatically because the past goals have been partially beneficial. It's extremely important. We are not hijacked along the development journey by goals. And this brings me to the second question, what is wrong with them? And implicit in this is my critique, which is that what's wrong with them is who set them. I mean, you know, who were the technocrats, and at that time I was in DFID, and you know, with the previous generation of the British government, and very much involved in setting them. And now, as we look back on them, I think the greatest critique of them is who are this bunch of do-gooders who, sitting together, said to the world, yes, you know, your children will go to school, you will have so many liters of water, you will wear a condom and protect yourself against malaria, and you will swelter under bed nets, and you will do this, that, and the other. And that's what's wrong with them, that they are goals which are well meant, but they are, I would not call them global goals in any sense of the term, because they don't reflect anyone's aspirations other than liberal do-gooders. I hope many of them are here in this audience. Now, what would I do as a beneficent dictator? Well, I would actually take a very liberationist approach. I would liberate the world from the tyranny of targets and indicators and open up people's minds about judging for themselves and liberating them to decide on the lives that they wish to follow in the context in which they live. Maybe there is a role for setting global goals at some particular level, but I think the world is now grown up. We are in the post-9/11 era, we are in the post-superpower era as well, and I think the idea that some beneficent dictatorship can go around dictating, however well meant that might be, I think completely misses the point, you see. So my kind of gift to my people, autonomous or not, would be to say, go forth, be free, and select for yourself the life that you want, and take responsibility for the decisions you make. And by the way, here are some broad global directions.
Well, thank you, Will. We're going to come back to that, Mukesh, but I'd like to start with a question to Bob. Maureen made the point that we've got to change to global goals. You've been a passionate champion for Africa. Should MDGs apply also to developed countries as well as to poor countries? Should we frame goals for universal achievement? Some people argue that what we should be doing is setting an outcome target for the poorest 10 or 20% in every country. Will universal goals disadvantage Africa?
Dramatically so, Barry. I would argue, in fact, I think there's a better case, rather than expanding the MDGs to include 6.3 billion people, including our part of the world, we should think about whether the next generation of MDGs, or indeed a set of MDGs, should be designed specifically for Africa. And the rest of the world will largely take care of itself. First of all, I mentioned in my opening remarks that the MDGs are what they are because that's what could be agreed. It's one thing to ask developed countries to agree how to fix other countries. Asking rich countries to agree how to fix themselves is mission impossible. that simply could not happen. So no, I would certainly not expand them in that direction. Africa is the only, the billionth African was born a year ago. Africa is the only part of the world that collectively is getting worse. The only part of the world where the gap between them and us is widening. There are other parts of the world where it is not narrowing fast, and parts of the world where it is narrowing dramatically quickly. But in Africa, it's widening. It is perfectly possible that the 53 countries of Africa, taken collectively, the billion people of Africa, will not meet any of the development goals collectively, not one of them. Individual countries will meet a number of MDGs, but collectively we're facing a dramatic failure. The head of the World Bank said the other day we should abolish the term third world because all parts of the world are becoming so much closer together so quickly that such terms are anachronistic. With respect to Africa, this is nonsense. But he points out to African growth at 6%. 6% of nothing isn't much. And the reality of Africa today is simply appalling in most definitions. Some of the numbers that we've seen up here before we started tell a happy story and certainly help me explain why development is important, and particularly development is important for Africa. Because development at the margin can make a difference with countries willing to walk that talk, willing to make a difference. I think we should be extremely harsh in our triage, particularly in Africa. We should work with countries that do walk that talk, that do govern reasonably and adequately, and we should drop the countries that don't, because we don't have enough to go around. The $120 billion we have to spend on development is almost exactly the amount that West Germany decided to spend on making then 18, now 13 million East Germans feel more German. The same amount of money. By the way, they haven't succeeded in 25 years in making the East Germans feel comfortable about being German. And we're trying to use that same amount of money to make 5 billion people more comfortable, or 1 billion Africans. It isn't nearly enough, so we should concentrate it where the political leadership is present and we can make a difference, and we should build fences around the money we're prepared to give to dramatically deteriorating security situations, aka failed states, and we should build fences around the amount of money we're prepared to give for humanitarian assistance. Otherwise, there won't be any left for development.
Mukesh, Maureen, do you agree with Bob? With respect to the universality?
No. With respect to Bob, no. Firstly, I think it's an excessively gloomy picture of Africa, and it does disservice to the work going on in Africa by the Africans themselves, where despite all the obstacles placed in their path by a world system, they have, and obstacles are placed in their own path, I should also add, they're actually doing pretty well. And country after country has democracy. Country after country, children are going to school. The HIV is on the retreat. Malaria is on the retreat. Industry is coming up. People are investing in Africa, and so on and so forth. So and this African Renaissance, if I may call it that, deserves greater respect and recognition. And I can't figure out how, in these days of globalization, where at a press of a button countries are bankrupted, when somebody takes hot money from one to another, how we're going to put up fences. I thought we lived in an age of breaking down fences, not constructing new ones. And firstly, it can't be done. And secondly, even if it could be done, that is not the way in which to actually make countries work together within Africa or outside Africa. I think concentrating in countries with good leadership begs the question of deciding where and how that leadership is defined, and then distinguishing who is the person who decides you are a deserving object for development aid, but you are a humanitarian basket case. We will get you to develop yourself. We will pick up, we'll throw a few crumbs at you when our domestic media agitates because they see starving babies on our screens. Clearly, that would not be a particularly developmental or a humanitarian approach either. So I beg to disagree.
Maureen, what about Bob's assertion that we should give pride of place to some African countries?
I don't disagree with giving pride of place, but I'm still caught up in trying to imagine how Mukesh's proposition that we move away from worrying about these kind of organized approaches to development assistance with targets and goals and outcomes and evaluations and all of that goes along with it, how one moves beyond that, and to what extent then how does money flow, or is money not important in this? Is something else more important than the money? I'm intrigued by what Mukesh has said, because it would definitely be a different development paradigm.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm not arguing that there should not be some developmental goals or some global visions, but I think the real purpose of development, what is the real purpose of development? What is that concept of a developed world? What will it look like once everyone has achieved their goals, targets, and ticked off the indicators? What will that world look like? And I worry about that. I don't want a world where people are kind of well-fed, well-watered, and have got the basic creature needs met, but fundamentally we haven't actually achieved our humanity. We haven't actually achieved our dignity. We are still we have created a global welfare state, if you like, you see, and not release the human potential that is in all of us, including in some of the most currently poverty-stricken countries. So I am in favor, really, of wanting to visit the relationships between nations and correcting that and looking at the enabling factors that hold people back from developing themselves, rather than throwing more money at the problem. If money was a solution, then we have got record amounts of money going into health, education, and so on. And though, for example, classrooms the world over are filling up with school children sitting in classrooms, they are emerging with no higher literacy today than possibly they were a generation ago. And that's what the latest evaluations indicate of the impact of education programs. And I worry about the billions gone on education, for example, which might have been put to better use to liberate people, to sustain their future, so their pride, hope, and dignity, and build their lives. So my vision of a development is not disorganized chaos with money just floating around, but simply a framework which recognizes that every community, every nation, every continent, every country has a right for self-determination and dignity, and for it to determine what its root is within global norms. And I think your conventions on economic and social rights and all those norms, if you like, are extremely important. There is no question of that. But I would reject any notion that somehow the UN or anyone is going to dictate what nations and countries are going to do. People are in a rebellious mood the world over. They're not going to follow somebody's targets. What they want is to take charge of their destinies, which is ultimately what development is about.
Bob, what are they missing?
Well, look, there's no doubt, Mukesh, that you are the happy optimist and I am the dark pessimist in this regard. I have an enormous affection for Africa, but I cannot ignore the fact that 30 years ago Africa accounted for 3.5% of world trade, and today it's less than 1.5%. I can't discount the appalling and unacceptable deaths due to disease of children under 5. Yes. The numbers we saw up here suggest to me that development is important, and indeed development works, but the bottom line numbers remain appalling, and more appalling in Africa than anywhere else, and therefore they need particular attention there. The suggestion that good governance is in the eye of the beholder, Well, perhaps. I can certainly point to you to a dozen cases of appalling government in Africa, and I would challenge you to disagree with me, but perhaps this is not the place for that. Nevertheless, it would be like shooting fish in a barrel in terms of getting this panel to agree that there are indeed cases of poor governments in Africa that should not be supported by development efforts, which means their people will suffer. Yes, it does, and a certain amount of humanitarian assistance can then kick in. But wasting scarce resources on such situations where right next door there are governments struggling to do the right thing is vital. Now, Barry, beforehand we had talked a little bit about the security dimension of all of this. It is, in my view, the most difficult development challenge. I mean,
The security question.
the security question.
Well, I just want to remind you of something you said to Peters Mansbridge
Yeah.
18 months ago. You said, "I cannot object to the objective in Afghanistan, but I just don't think in the West that we're prepared to invest the blood or the treasure to get this done." You said, "There isn't enough to go around, and in our 6 billion people, there are 1 billion happy rich people, and there are 1 billion desperately miserably poor people, and 4 billion people in the middle who are a lot closer to the bottom billion than the top. We don't have nearly enough money and energy." So what does this mean for those who say that we really got to do something about putting failed states in the next generation of goals?
I wouldn't do it because it is too subjective and too volatile a concept, and perhaps more germane, whether we did it or not, it would have absolutely no effect. The decisions of the security gang will be utterly unbound by anything that we might introduce into a scheme like this. That's the reality. To pretend otherwise is to dream. Yes, I certainly stand by what I said re-Afghanistan 18 months ago, or what I wrote 4 years ago about Afghanistan. It is all unfortunately coming true. I still don't know why we're in Afghanistan. I mean, we went there because out of solidarity with our allies who'd suffered the horror of 9/11, and we went there to destroy Al-Qaeda. Well, we didn't do that. And then the narrative changed almost monthly among the many governments in the 40-nation coalition, and suddenly we're nation building again, and we're fighting for democracy in Afghanistan. Give me a break. And we're fighting to put little girls in school. If Afghanistan were the last place in the universe where little girls were not in school, fighting to put them there might make sense. But I can show you virtually every country in Africa where little girls really want to go to school, and you don't have to kill anybody to put them there. And therefore, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that you would go to the most difficult place in the world to put kids in school to start there. But I find it appalling that Afghanistan and Iraq are among the top 4 aid recipients of Canada. This is what I was arguing in terms of the tyranny of the bureaucrats in terms of recasting the development agenda. That said, if Nigeria explodes, by the way, one population stat, and we never talk enough about population generally in the development equation because it's politically incorrect, and particularly we never talk about it enough in Africa. In 1950, Nigeria had a population of 50 million. Today it has a population of 150 million, and according to the UN's median projection line, in 2050, 39 years from now, it will have a population of 313 million. In 1950, 15% of Nigeria's population lived in cities. In 2050, 75% of the 313 million people will live in cities. Now that is an enormously volatile equation. And if Nigeria goes, it will take the upper half of Africa with it. And therefore, can we ignore such a security dimension with difficulty? Thank you.
Mukesh, let me remind you of an interview you gave to PBS in November 2007. You noted you'd been to Bosnia. You'd seen some of the after effects of Srebrenica. You've been in Rwanda within hours of the liberation of Kigali, and had been in Goma on the day the actual mass exodus took place. There's this horrific quote, quote, "I could smell the dead bodies in Rwanda, which was still fresh when I had got to them," end quote. You've also been to Cambodia. In that interview, you talked about the need for accountability and your real disappointment with the resolution on responsibility to protect, on the doctrine of responsibility to protect. So what does this experience mean in terms of your advice, in terms of including security in setting development goals?
Well, first thing I would say, and this is to respond to Bob, is precisely because of experiencing Rwanda, Darfur, Bosnia, and such like, that I remain optimistic. Because when you actually witness such obscene horror, and you realize that this is not something that only happens in one part of the world and not another. Every continent has been blighted with that within this current generation alive. You realize there has to be a better future. So smelling the blood, which still comes back to me when anytime anybody ever mentions Rwanda to me, actually makes me even more determined that we have to have a more optimistic, a more hopeful vision of the future. Because we, as well-bred, well-fed, and well-watered, fully righted human rights citizens of fortunate countries we live in, start losing vision and hope, then there is no hope and vision for those who do not have the luxury to dream, if you like, you see. So we have an ultimate responsibility not to forget, but above all else, to rise above all these horrors and move forward. That's what really keeps me going, at least in that sense. To answer your question directly, I think absolutely security is a prerequisite for anything we do. But the security does not mean the forms of military security that have been seen to fail now in theater after theater after theater. What is security? Is it the security imposed by some kind of old style, relationships between nations which establish a hegemony of one against the other? Is it a security that people gain by belonging to particular groups of countries and ensure themselves within those particular groups of countries? That's no security for ordinary people. In Africa, more people are killed, by AK-47s and small weapons, some of them going back decades, than nuclear bombs and such like, you see. So yes, security is very, very important, but the definition of security is not the security that our leaders of the world talk about when they think of spending their energies on North Korea, Iran, and all those features. Those issues are important in a geopolitical sense, but those are not the security issues of concern to ordinary people, ordinary lives, whose well-being is blighted every day by the insecurity on the streets, whether it's the slums of Kingston, Jamaica, or the battlefields of undeclared wars in many parts, for example, in Africa itself.
Maureen, let's switch gears for a second. In your current foundation, you have some intriguing programs. You've got an award program called the Mythbusters Award. You've got an Excellence Through Evidence Award. You led the International Development Research Center for 10 years and North-South Institute before that. Tell us, from your experience, what works?
Well, first of all, there's absolutely no easy answer to that. Whether what works or what's a myth. I think it's a myth that development assistance doesn't work, that transfer of resources does not work, doesn't always work. I mean, do we as individuals always spend money on the right things? Probably not. But I would be much more on the side of Bob in terms of underlining the importance of continuing that flow of resources. I'm still trying to figure out how Mukesh's vision, which strikes me as kind of California in the 60s, but for people worldwide,
how you eat hope.
How you eat hope. I'm still much more on the side of the benefits of actually sharing income. I think that people have a lot more hope when they have food than when they don't. So I think it's a big myth that development assistance does not work. I think we've got endless studies, statistics, etc., that shows that it does make a difference in people's lives. For people who really want to follow this up, you can go on the website of the Overseas Development Institute in the UK and look at the long list of changes that have occurred assisted by global investments from other countries directed towards problems of a whole range of problems, whether we're talking about maternal and child health, whether we're talking about immunization rates, whether we're talking about, you can make fun of mosquito nets, but in fact, the impact of bed nets is well demonstrated on malaria, particularly for children. So I think it's a big myth that development assistance doesn't work. I think it makes it really easy to discount the need for sharing between people and between countries. It's very easy to say this doesn't make any sense, it's only a waste of money. And while I agree with Bob that that we're learning more all the time about how to have effective development partnerships and how to make decisions about where that money goes, to deny that additional resources can be useful, I think is just a way of excusing ourselves and saying it doesn't matter, they can't do it, and let's just leave it up to them in their kind of happy, hopeful circles that Mukesh is talking about. I think the harder question, a harder question even than the resource question, is what we do in terms of being useful to assisting the development of the rule of law, human rights, the whole range of human security questions. What do we as outsiders, how do we effectively intervene? Even once we accept that it's a good thing to do, once we accept that responsibility to protect makes sense, and are we responsible in Libya? Why did we let Burma sit there for all those? In other words, how do those decisions get made? So how do the countries of the world make effective in the implementation of their hopes? Because I've always felt that just about all of the decisions on the non-security side of the UN, the conventions, the conferences, think back to not just the UN decade, but it went on for longer than that. These documents emerge, but these were not documents that were like a planning document from the Privy Council office, or maybe they are, but they were really a litmus test of how people in the world, or some people in the world, saw things going. So Bob is right. The Millennium Development Goals were what people could agree to. That was what they said, yes, these 8 things really are important. Just like all of the countries said those 152 resolutions or whatever they were in the last document on women's equality were important. And certainly somebody should do them. Maybe not them, but somebody. So they're a litmus test of what people are thinking at a particular moment in time. So we shouldn't give all of that up, but we also should really worry about, we have to worry about taking our responsibilities in the world. We have to worry about what we can do to make a difference in poor countries, or how we can share with middle-income countries policy approaches we've used ourselves. I'm a big believer, when we talk about middle-income countries, in a vast expansion of the OECD to be the vehicle for analysis and for sharing. But I do agree that for the poorest countries and the poorest people in poor countries, that transfer of money still matters.
I'm left with...
Barry, can I just...
only if you disagree with her.
with you or with...
With her.
No, unfortunately I don't, but I'd like to remarkably and startlingly agree with one tiny thing Mukesh said.
All right.
At last.
I mean, amidst all that California dreaming that Mukesh was engaged in, he did say that investment mattered and was vital. And I don't want to leave that lie, because it is so vitally important. Even remittances to Africa now are twice the value of official development assistance, and investment is 4 times that. Outside investment in Africa is now in excess of $1 trillion a year. Canada is a leading investor in Africa, particularly in the mining sector, and that will make a fundamental difference to Africa. And it's the only thing, I think, because there will not be, in my view, enough development money. We have to keep flowing that money, but there will never be enough. What will make the difference is what made the difference in our country. What will make the difference is foreign investment creating jobs. Thank you.
Mukesh, is there anything that Bob said you want to agree with?
I totally agree with him, and I think it's not absolutely, Maureen. I totally agree with you also that development cooperation assistance has made a difference to lives, especially in the poorest parts of the world who had no other options at the time. No question about that. And good quality development cooperation assistance will get you better outputs than bad quality cooperation assistance. Unfortunately, having served a lifetime of being an administrator of development cooperation assistance, and now having the misfortune to be at the other end of trying to receive development cooperation assistance, much of it really bad one, I do know that one of the most pernicious things in the world is aid dependency. So by creating a generation of, more than a generation of nations dependent on handouts, denervated by and held down by conditionalities which suit the donor rather than the recipient, is, I think, not necessarily a very, very good form of investment, I would say. One question for Africa, if I may say so. Today,
shouldn't you get in line with
with them, sorry. But there's one factual thing that needs to be corrected.
All right.
I think today, the reality is that the world's poorest peoples, definitely they're living in Africa, but if you add up the numbers, the world's poorest populations are living in the rich and the middle income countries. So India, unfortunately India, my beloved country of birth, has the reputation of actually, it might be a brick star and going places, but it is also a host to the most abject and poor people of the world, greater than in Africa. Now, this is not to set up Africa versus the rest of the world debate. I think solidarity has to extend to all vulnerable and poor people, wherever they might be based. But what it shows is that poverty is no longer an issue of developed countries and developing countries. Here in Canada, I hear in the short 2 days I've spent here, the abject conditions in which your Aborigines and other people in the substratum of Canadian society live. That's why I worry as much about poor Canadians as I might want to worry about poor Indians or poor Africans. And unless we think in those global terms, unless we build that global solidarity which overcomes our national pride of being a donor and a receiver, we will not make progress towards the world that I dream of. I wasn't in California in the 1960s, but come to think of it, it's actually not a bad dream. And if it worked for California, at least for some time, why deny the rest of the world that opportunity also? And dreams are very important. In the end, if you can't help people, everyone, every time, everywhere, don't take away their dreams and hopes.
I'd like to open it up to the audience now. I have 3 questions. I'd like to come back to the panel, but enough from them for now. The three questions are for Mukesh. He was provocative at the beginning, saying what's wrong with the MDGs was they weren't set up, the goals were not established by the intended beneficiaries. So I'd like to ask him, how would he go about asking all these intended beneficiaries to identify their priorities. And then, Maureen, I'd want to know how would we ensure, whatever the goals are, that our policies and programs ensure that the poorest people benefit. And then it's a shame to leave a group like this without exploiting the experience of Bob Fowler in terms of he's oiled his way around the floor in the Security Council and the halls of the UN. If we could agree amongst ourselves what the framework should be, how can we get it? How can we get the UN and the world to go along with that framework? What kind of a process would you design to market our ideal solution? But I'd like to come back to those three questions if you have none in the audience. So anybody who wants to step to a mic, we'd be pleased to take some questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Not really. There's two rules, by the way. First, you have to state your name, if we can hear you. State your name, and then give us as brief a question as you can.
Okay, my name is Joyce Dietrich, and I've recently come home from a trip to Cuba. And I think you will probably all agree that Cuba has achieved many of the goals that are set out by these guidelines. However, it's still a very poor country. The individual income is, for a teacher, university educated, is between $1 and $2 a day in our money. So they live, and they are also a hungry people. But they are, I will say I was very, this is a bit long, I was very impressed with their nationalism and their, maybe we'd say their dream. And they are encouraging more entrepreneurial education and so on. But I do think that that we have to question, that a country that still achieves the high levels of maternity and health and all that sort of thing is still so poor. And I know part of it's the American embargo. But I wonder if any of you are familiar with that.
Anybody want to take that one? Cuba?
I think that I'm not an expert in Cuba, but I think that it's absolutely true that many of the MDGs have been met in Cuba, and indeed they have a terrific early childhood education program which shows significant benefits in children's health up many years. But they have not, except on the side, encouraged the kind of freedom of choices for people's lives that Mukesh has talked about. Now, there could be a long debate about, well, is that better or is that worse? They have fewer children who are really poor. But on the other hand, their standards of living are not rising, and it would also support another of Mukesh's points, Cuba would, because they had a considerable amount of aid from the Soviet Union until 1989, and that broke up, and then their economy really tanked. Neither have they been they have not been open to researchers and intellectuals who did not stick with their notion of what progress looked like. And I know this from the International Development Research Center, which financed some of the earliest work on studying non-Marxist, on developing non-Marxist economists. And the people who had participated in that program, when they went over the line, found themselves collecting garbage in Havana, and that's actually a true story. So they did not value personal choices, and they did not make it easy to develop wealth through either their own investments, although they were hospitable to Canadian mining investments. So complex country, lots of things they've done well, lots of things they did better than the rest of Latin America, and lots of things that look better than some of the lives of people in North America.
Thank you.
Okay. Online to the panel from Sammy and Waterloo, given that not all countries have the same goals and resources, is it possible to envision MDGs so that they promote localized goals in individual countries? Mukesh?
I think that's a very good suggestion. I think it allows a marriage between global norms, so you could set global, if you like, goals on which we can hardly disagree, but health, gender equality, and all those things, and then allow communities and nations to decide on their own targets, on how to put the goals in action in their own particular circumstances, and what investment for them to bring in. And this marriage of local ownership and global norms, I think, offers us the way forward, where we can address our common aspirations to a better world. Yes?
Please, your name and a brief question, please.
My name is Asif Farouk. I'm in an MA Political Science program at the University of Waterloo. My question is what it would take for countries like Canada as well as other developed countries to devise as well as enforce effective policy for multinational companies that are involved in extracting natural resources in developing countries. Because as far as I can remember, last year Bill C-300 was not passed in Canada, as well as Canada hasn't effectively supported, besides just giving a lip service to EITI, which is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, because I believe these are very important for these developing countries in achieving the MDG goals as part of the profound debates for how to achieve the development. Thank you.
Bob, do you want to take that?
Well, sure. Let me start off. And first of all, I think it's a wholly legitimate and very important question. And the essence of my answer will be practical. And to the extent that we forget our own past, we get into trouble. When mining began in this country, when we were building railways, etc., the labor norms and monitoring of such were very imperfect. And we worked through that into a better standard. The reason people mine in Africa, say, is partly because of the resources that people are interested in are in Africa, but it's also because labor is cheap in Africa. And that is what is attracting this huge amount of investment there. To the extent that we make labor significantly less cheap in Africa, we are going to discourage investment. It is a horrible reality in that equation. Canada should and can never accept that Canadian companies will misbehave in Africa and contravene essential codes. And as you mentioned, there are a number of important international codes out there which Canada has espoused and which ought to be applied. I think Canada, through CETA, ought to be working with countries in which we are mining to ensure that their mining codes are reasonable, applicable, and we ought to be teaching them how to apply them, how to train monitors, and how to ensure that miners behave properly. We have something like 1,400 miners, different companies, from very tiny to very big, operating in Africa. And the reality of today's world is that the misbehavior of 2 or 3 gets all the attention. So we have to be concerned about such things, but I've had Canadians tell me that we simply should not be mining in Africa. That mining is a nasty, tough, dangerous, low-paying business, and we ought not to be doing such things in Africa. To that, I would say that is nonsense. Mining in Africa is producing jobs, including some quite sophisticated jobs, mostly pretty basic jobs, exactly the way it happened in our country 150 years ago. So we should be doing more of that. We should be doing it intelligently. We should be doing it according to international norms and standards, and we should be helping the countries that we are mining in to meet those standards.
Okay. I have a question online. We have about 50 people, I'm told, online watching this webcast. To Mukesh from Gordon online. Can you talk to us more about dignity? Dignity in quotes. It seems to me to be, it's at the core of what's happening in the Middle East. How do people define dignity? It's difficult for those of us who are well off to comprehend. How do people define dignity, and do they make it into our framework of goals?
Interesting. Let me just quickly start from a personal angle, really. At the age of 6, being brought up in the Indian state of Bihar, that was in the 1960s, and was undergoing one of its periodic famines, which it did at that time. And seeing a sort of bag of wheat in the house, which had a strange flag on it, which I did not recognize, and asking my mother what this was. And she said, and it was an American flag with 2 clasped hands on it, and underneath it said, gift of the American people, food for peace, or food for something, food for peace, I think, yeah. My mother saying to me, we should be grateful for the Americans because they've sent us this food to eat. And I remember being dutifully grateful, and a few seconds later in my 6-7-year-old brain, the question arose, deeply resenting these distant American people, and my self-humility that my family and I, and my country and I, were somehow dependent on these distant and generous Americans to feed us. And how humiliating can that be? And the interesting thing was, and I remember this too well to this day, following this period of gratitude and self-feeling kind of thing, how undignified we are as Indians, that we have to be fed a feeling of resentment. Who are these rich people who are feeding us? I hasten to add that I have many good American friends, and in case there are visa issues around my statement, my daughter is married to an American, and I love Americans, so you get my point. But the point I'm trying to make is dignity is about, and dignity and development are the same thing. They are actually the same words. It is about people being made to feel human and being able to make to feel the ability to control their lives. And if someone is doing things to you all the time and telling you what to do, then that's undignified. And what's happening in the Middle East is a battle for dignity. And this is not a war between the Western values and Eastern values, or Islamic values or Christian values. It is about people, ordinary people, who maybe come from many religions or any religion or none, actually wanting to be treated as human beings. So their battle, if you like, is the battle for dignity. And I would submit that a true developmental approach and the models for our future of vision of development must have dignity at the very core of it. And I think it is possible to set targets for dignity and even measure how dignified a community, a people, or a nation really are. It's measurable. Ask the people.
The acoustics leave a little bit to be desired, so please give us your name and your question, and give us your question very slowly.
Okay, can you hear me perfectly?
Yes.
Perfect. My name is Antonia Ogundele, and I'm a MES student in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. Thank you very much for all of your discussions. I am currently researching Goal 7, Target 11, improving the lives of slum dwellers as a part of my thesis. And so I just want to preface that for my question. What I've noticed in my literature and in doing a lot of the research, and by no means am I an expert in MDGs, but the question that comes to me is, well, what are the purpose of the Millennium Development Goals? Because what I've found is that throughout the discussion that I've heard so far today, it's been a lot about the movement of resources, ensuring that there are enough resources to fulfill needs. But then fundamentally what I'm finding in my readings is that there's the movement of resources, but are we actually trying to improve the lives of the individuals that are actually being affected by these movement of resources? And I bring this I'll bring an example forward in that if we bring in a global north kind of perspective, if we look at improving the housing conditions of low-income individuals, what we have seen historically is that there have been slum demolitions, and here we have situations such as Regent Park, which are now going through another demolition because they were trying to meet certain, whether it be federal or municipal targets. And I wanted to evaluate and look at what is actually happening in the Global South. So currently, from what I understand, is that they have reached the target and have surpassed it by 100% and have improved the lives of 227 million people. But there has been a fundamental difference on the ground. Yes, they've improved the physical environment, but it's either not being maintained and the situation is still worsening. So again, what is the purpose of Millennium Development Goals? Is it to improve or show development in the lives of the individuals, or is it simply a policy tool or something that administrators can look at and say, well, this is where we're going to direct our money? Because I would agree with Maureen in saying that the data and the collection of data and statistics may prove to be a better measure of where to move resources. Thanks.
Maureen, you want to take that one?
Okay, I had a bit of a hard time hearing it, but what is the purpose? I think the purpose of the Millennium Development Goals is the same kind of, is underpinned by the same purpose that got us the various conventions to which I alluded. The purpose is to identify a set of issues, a set of questions, a set of hopes around which the world community can unify and later act. So it's not, the United Nations exists for many reasons. One of them is to play to our better side, if I could put it that way. And therefore, therefore we have conventions on the rights of the child, conventions on women's equality. The Millennium Development Goals was an opportunity created by people who wanted to see better standards set for world behavior. I mean, I'm putting it up at that high level. It's not like then there's a kind of an army of public servants deployed from this point in order to carry them out. That's not how the world works. But they can act as an inspiration for action on the part of people around the world. And it's the aspirational element that I think is related to the hope that Mukesh talks about. We would like to think that we would be able to organize our resources around the world in order to address these 8 goals effectively. So this is our better side as citizens of the world. And the purpose is to put them out there as something to strive for.
Okay. Next. Tell us your name, please, and a brief question.
Yes, my name is Marcus Esmitz. And a comment before I give you my question. It relates to a word that Maureen used at least twice, and also referred to it in other ways. And Bob also talked about it.
I assure you it was not a 4-letter word.
I didn't say it was.
Okay.
And that is the question of resources, and particularly scarce resources and the allocation of resources. And what happens to those. A lot of the discussion seems to have gone around that. A quick comment. I was in the Caribbean just recently on a project, and I talked with a minister of industry in a particular government, and he said, as part of the discussion, he said, well, we all know what the problems are, we all know what the solutions are, but we don't do anything about it, which I found absolutely atrocious on the part of a minister of that particular country. I'd also heard that a number of other times in other places in the Caribbean and in Africa. So my question comes back to implementation, which is not a 4-letter word, but it seems to be a 4-letter word because it doesn't really happen. The EU, for example, came up with a statistic for money that went into the Caribbean over the last 10 years, and 17% of the allocated funds were actually taken up. 83% was not used. Similar figures abound for Africa. So my question is, how can we be practical and get this implementation to actually happen, as opposed to merely having nice Millennium Development Goals, which make us all feel good, which are at a higher level, but ultimately very little happens unless you get down to the local level. Back to Mukesh's comment about people feeling good, well-fed, well-watered, everyone knows the old adage, all politics is local, all good development also is local. Thank you.
I know if Jim Balsillie was posed your question on how to make implementation work, he would say you better get the incentives and the sanctions right, and he would have no trouble setting them out. But Maureen, what would you want to respond to that? Implementation.
I think that that implementation in terms of using development resources does come down to the capacity of the society, of the government in that particular country to be able to manage it, to have the structures that permit them to actually spend the money. And this is what Bob was saying earlier, when if he were running things, he would be highly selective in the countries where he was going to allocate the money. Now Mukesh, since he's going down to the local community, might think of something entirely different, which is creating community funds that individuals and groups of individuals could make application to, sort of like, for those of you as old as me in the audience, like, say, opportunities for youth in Canada in the funds that were set aside in the late 60s, early 70s, where communities applied for funds, very not particularly tight terms of reference, but these were submissions were made, decisions were made. You'd have to sort out who's making those decisions. Maybe it would be the local elders, in which case probably women wouldn't get a cent, but you'd have to deal with that problem. I mean, the fact is that you have to understand where you can transfer resources so they can be used. Another problem that comes about when donors start getting very choosy and selective, and so they say only these 42 countries or only these 17 countries, and suddenly a country gets on everybody's list, then you get into the problem not only of take-up, as our intervener mentioned, but the problem that Mukesh alluded to, which is potentially too much in the way of aid going in. And then also, embarrassingly for donors, what happens is something blows up in the country. Bolivia comes to mind. For a little while there, Bolivia was on everybody's list. And so lots of money was flowing in because donors, mindful of their citizens' concern about well-used tax dollars, all were putting this money in, and then completely independently there was a political foo-for-ah, and so then suddenly they fell off the list. So it's extraordinarily difficult to make those decisions. But I do think that it would be really interesting to go down, because I still have been pushing Mukesh to say, okay, how does the money transfer hands, or is there not money involved in his vision of choice? But maybe there should be some experimentation with very general pots of money that are put out, that people make submissions from the community level for, and then this is how you have to sort out how you make the decisions about who gets it. Then there'd be some test for take-up.
I think if I may just add a sentence, I think Maureen is right, and by the way, I'm all in favor of money, so if anyone is offering, I definitely would not say no on behalf of the many communities represented by the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent. Now, but the quality of the money is very important. And money on some of the terms that is on offer, it's not worth it. If you have to either prostitute yourself, or if you have to tie yourself up in knots, if you have to lose your internal dignity, if you have to fill in a triplicate forms in triplicate, and you have to then go through several hoops to deliver what, then please take your money. So it's not money, and resource transfers are important, but they have to be on the terms of the people being helped. not in terms of the giver. This is where aid conditionality, the countries which condition the giving of aid to the tying of national interests, whether it's Canadian national interests in Afghanistan or British national interests in North Africa, this is not genuine development assistance. By all means, use aid to bolster your national interests, but don't call it development cooperation transfer. Really, don't abuse the term development cooperation by linking that. Any aid that is tied to the pursuit of national objectives of a particular country is understandable. This is what citizens pay their dollars for, to keep them safe. I'm not against that. But it is a quite a different kind of development cooperation assistance than the other stuff that we are really talking about from a genuine hearts and minds perspective.
Please tell us your name and your question.
Good evening. My name is Bashir Habib. I'm from Kishore Waterloo. First of all, I'd really like to thank the entire panel. It's quite an honor to be in the midst of the panelists here, and the discussion is fascinating. I've traveled extensively in Africa and in the Indian subcontinent and seen a lot of development projects where Canadian expertise and money is being used for the last 50 years or so. Two questions, really, and they're very short and related. The first one is, we've been talking about how we can help the developing countries, Africa and Asia, improve. So we are really looking at it from a very kind of a maternalistic point of view. But that is changing, obviously. My first question would be to the panelists is that from your experience, from your global experience, what is the take-home lesson that we ourselves here have gained from working with these developing countries? What are, instead of saying that these are the things that we've given it to them, what have we taken from them that has changed us? Okay, because that's critical, and that's leading up to my next...
Before we do that, let's have the answer, because that's a very good question, and I'll let you have the floor for the second question. But what have we learned?
Excellent question. I'm very glad you asked it. I think the first lesson is in humility. I think it is recognizing that in our more developed, so-called more developed societies, things are not as good as they could be. The relationships amongst different members of the community, rich and poor and so on, is not optimal. And the way society is organized could be improved. And to understand that some of the techniques we use in traditional development, the good quality development cooperation programs, like local ownership, local participation, local leadership, and looking after the most vulnerable, enabling people to fish for themselves rather than giving them a fish to eat. Those kinds of lessons could be equally applied anywhere, in this part of the world. The second lesson to learn is that you cannot divorce aid policies from wider policies in the country. You can't, for example, have a health policy going in one direction, education policy going in another direction, and social welfare policy going in another direction, because they contradict each other. This policy coherence and taking consistent approach is extremely important. And we see this time and time again when incoherence comes in, and either the quality of the aid has impact which you don't want, or in fact has perverse impacts. And that's true, I think, domestically, and as it would be for overseas aid for any country.
Please.
Having just reflecting on the really significant success that the International Development Research Center has had by supporting individual researchers and research groups in developing countries. This is not sending Canadian expertise. This is sending Canadian dollars to the right spot, to people who are innovators in those countries. And what sort of innovations? Research that IDRC supported years ago in China really led to the development of different strains of canola that Canada has later found and extraordinarily useful themselves. That's sort of on that sort of level of what has been learned. Learned that way ahead of us, and in this, the home of RIM, that nurses in Uganda were using handheld computing devices to collect patient information in remote nursing stations and sending them to the hospital in Kampala way before we were actually doing this on a routine basis in Canada. Looking at the use of that kind of device by nurses disproved the view in South Africa that it would be impossible to roll out effective antiretroviral programs. We are yet to effectively use mobile devices to give reminders to people with chronic diseases about taking their pills for this or that. There's lots to be learned, and I'm talking about from research that has been done in developing countries. And what else did we learn? We learned that the people who were funded through IDRC valued the fellowship, the collaboration, the access to our scholars as much as they valued the money. Although, as I reminded my colleagues, if we didn't have the money, we wouldn't have those relationships in the first place. So lots learned, lots of very practical things. And the relatively new program, the Grand Challenges program that Peter Singer is running out of the University of Toronto, which is now focusing on bedside, on diagnostics, inexpensive diagnostics, could help us transform the way in which primary care physicians do their jobs in Canada. They're funding that work internationally, but that could transform the way in which primary care physicians do their work here. So lots to be learned.
Bob?
Well, I guess, obviously, this is a question that I think each of us would like to spend a long time on because it's so vital. I'm going to talk a little bit about...
You should buy Bob's forthcoming book if you really want to know everything that he's learned.
I think I'm going to talk about something we haven't learned. We haven't appreciated, we haven't encaissé, we haven't absorbed the extent to which the development business is a long-term commitment. We increasingly, in our attention deficit-addled politics, want fast returns, and to some extent, the MDGs exacerbate that problem. Because development has fallen somewhat out of vogue, despite the very good numbers. Oxford Policy Management estimates that 70 to 85% of all discrete development projects achieve their objectives. Despite that, we want quantifiable early returns. And we know in our heart that doesn't usually work. But nevertheless, in order to satisfy the beast, be it the newspapers, be it the auditor, be it the need for the development minister to stand up and say, Eureka, we go for the easy wins. Jeff Sachs has helped us a lot in that regard too. And to the extent that we move towards quantifiable MDGs, we are exacerbating that trend. Mukesh suggested earlier very accurately, we all want to tell you how many more kids are in school than was the case last year. We're not asking how many kids are in each classroom. And it's terrific that I saw one classroom in northern Uganda where there was one 19-year-old teacher teaching 338 kids in one class. By the way, it was a better behaved class than any class I've seen in Canada, but nevertheless, it's pretty hard to teach 338 kids at the same time. But the MDGs lead you down that path, and we have to be worried about that.
My colleagues were so pleased with the profundity and brevity of your question that we'd like you to ask another.
Thank you. I think you may have answered my second question in your discussion, but the thing that resonated with me, the second question, was what Dr. Kapila said, that, and this is what I noticed as well in Africa and some of the other countries that I traveled, the issue of relationship building. Critical fragmentation, post-colonial problems, a lack of trust. So, Dr. Kapila, knowing what you know now about the importance of relationship building, how should we do it differently?
Well, I think I did my life in the wrong order. I should have actually, instead of being a very powerful donor with a lot of money to give away at a reasonably young age, but knowing perhaps very little about real life, and then now coming the other end of my life, thinking of receiving, trying to argue to get money, I would say I would actually trust people much more. I would say that those who are in the business of receiving aid, we must remember that they're not doing it to cheat you, to actually put money in their pockets. Yes, there is corruption, but actually poor people are not the ones who are corrupt. That those who actually stoop down to be the aid recipients are because they're the most vulnerable, because they're left out of they're out of options in terms of actually preserving their own ability to rule their own lives and their families and such like. And I would have much more trust in the system. I would have much more trust in communities. I would allow much more local devolved decision making. And I would allow governments, including some of the corrupt ones, I would not condone corruption, but I would say that we should give people the benefit of the doubt. And be a little less measurement focused, a little less reductionist in approach, a little less, wanting to question your own motives for giving aid rather than trying to count every bean and expecting every single bean to result in 2 beans as an outcome, and let that happen. And you might find, opening your hearts and minds that way, you might find that the world responds in a completely different way. And it might actually have a transformative effect, if you like. So going back to my 30 years of experience at the UN, in a government, in the Red Cross now, in NGOs, in academics, and so on, I would say the best thing we can do with aid is to allow people to come together, to unite, to find a common ground to move forward, rather than to break things up and to further polarize the world we live in, and to allow diversity and respect for that. And then you would be surprised how much innovation, how much energy is unleashed by that, which to me is the real value of development. And I regret that some of our traditional development policies, some of our traditional development institutions, of which I have been a part, both in making policy and in setting the institutions along certain tracks, they have made a business out of their kind of vocation, rather than actually being a service, if you like, for what they're intended to. These are harsh words, perhaps, and I'm sure Maureen may not agree with that, but I think a bit of humility, after 50 years of development cooperation assistance, where record amounts of money has actually gone out, is in order before we move on beyond 2015.
I'll take 2 more questions. Your name, please?
Hi, my name is Cal Curra. Just a quick question looking forward. If we have the MDG Summit review in 2013 and then the MDG deadline in 2015, just where the political energy and the momentum is coming from for the if there is going to be a next generation of MDGs. If they first came from the 2000 Millennium Summit, then Monterey in 2002, and some key stakeholders getting behind that, and then the G8 around Gleneagles looking to come to get some money, so the UK quite demonstratively led that. Who's going to do that nowadays? Now the G8 have sort of declined to get involved in development anymore, and they passed the G20, and the G20 has very different views within the G20 on what aid should look like, what development should be defined as. Where do you think the momentum, or if there is going to be any momentum, going forward to take a look at a new framework for MDGs beyond 2015?
You want to take that, or you want
Yeah,
to
well, I can comment on it. I think it's important that the post-15 agenda is not hijacked by one particular faction or another. It'd be great if the G8 and the G20 showed leadership, but to replace the leadership of the G8 by a leadership of the G20 doesn't necessarily take us forward without either the quality or the inclusiveness of the leadership changing. To be ruled by 8 dictators or to be ruled by 20 dictators is, I don't think, a kind of more legitimate or a happier experience of being ruled by 8 dictators. So for me, the energy, it's important that the energy does not come from a selected group of people, whether they're the G8, G20, or whatever. They have a role and a responsibility which they must discharge with due humility and and the word humility I keep on using all the time, it's in short supply, and with respect for dignity and diversity, and they should take their historical responsibilities in that regard. But the real energy must come from nations around the world, from communities, from people who should be enabled to take charge of their own destiny. Therefore, those who mean good for the world, the best thing they can do is not to prejudge the conclusions, but to allow the energy to be released, allow many voices to be heard, and allow the kind of catalysis of the needs of people from all over the world to be heard and come together. And that would generate a much more powerful energy than any group of people sitting in conference rooms.
Okay.
Maureen,
come back. I didn't like your body language. You didn't like that answer?
I agree. Well, obviously, I agree entirely that it should come from the countries that are recipient countries, developing countries, the ones that are actually doing the work to create the development that needs to happen. But there is a realism that goes on that the G20 has a very strong idea of what development looks like. China is very involved in FDI and really wants to put its investment in for its own particular resource needs, as do other countries beyond China, though it has the most money. So the reality is the G20 will play a role on that, and they will dictate a lot of the debate at the UN and a lot of the international institutions that are mandated to go and do the work, the World Bank, the UN, IMF, what have you. So while I agree with you, unless we can come up with a really good mechanism to make that happen, the reality is it's going to come from the usual conference rooms, be it in Paris in November or in Mexico City in 2012. So the question is how do we make that work, and how do we get your ideas and your strong way of developing countries to play a role in that without the sort of the default happening?
Yeah. Do you want to take that?
I want to add my take to the question you asked me that we've got to get to at some point, because it's very relevant to.
Right. Well, we'll come back.
I just want to go back to that. But actually, it is technically and technologically possible to marry Mukesh's idea of actually understanding what people at local levels, and remember, at local levels increasingly means downtown in a big city. It's not all people sitting around the baobab tree. It's in urban areas. Because you certainly could do the kind of polling that GlobeScan, which is a very interesting polling company led by Canadian Doug Miller, does. And you could do a series of deliberative polls around the world and look at what people say. And there could be choices. If you had 3 wishes for your community or your family, what would they be? I mean, it would be very interesting to do that, and at the same time ask the question: well, how does this get codified? What does this mean? What does it mean for the government in question where those people live? What does it mean then for the international community? How different is the message that would come through this medium from what people who are looking at this big set of questions more analytically, or from their perspective as managers or politicians, both in the developing countries or in our country. It'd be very interesting to do a comparison of what people are thinking and what they see, and it's not technologically impossible. The more people are in cities, the easier it is to do, and then you can do it all over with the magic of telecommunications. So that might be worth doing. I want to get to my question at some point, but Bob wants to get to his. We're dying to answer the questions that Barry gave to us. Are you coming back?
I'm going to take one more question from the floor, and then we'll do the 3 questions, except you pretty well answered Mukesh's.
It's
please, your name and a brief question.
It's John Smith. Given that 15,000 years ago, this country was covered with a lot of ice, and given today that the world seems to be warming up, what are we doing about controlling our population?
Here, here. Very damn little.
Yeah, except, can I comment on that? I mean, I think that this is the move of people to cities has always been in all countries a kind of natural contraceptive. People have fewer children when they move into cities. That's exactly what happened in Canada. It was before the pill that birth rates began to go down because it's simply not practical.
Education and urban.
Well, no, but people weren't educating people. In fact, in Canada at that point, it was still illegal to talk about it. Never mind educating. But the move to cities is an extremely important factor in stabilizing population. And actually, if you look at projections, although people can still get terribly fussed about it, the lines are coming down, and it's very much related to the demographic shifts taking place within
Not in
countries.
Africa.
No, it is coming down. The desired number of children is down. It's still, but the fact is that there are still lots of people, but it's not true that it's an inexorable rise.
I think
Well, sorry, I'm just, I'm preoccupied by some numbers here. And what are we doing about it? The answer I said was very little, and the reason we're not dealing with it is because it's politically sensitive.
Because people didn't hear that.
I say the reason we are not dealing with the population issue is because it is politically, religiously sensitive. The combination of fundamentalists, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim in particular, is such that countries, including our own, will not move this issue forward. It is, of course, hugely culturally sensitive. Maureen, the numbers I would throw at you are, I mean, when rock stars took over foreign policy in the early 80s,
you never had the bracelets, you see, at foreign affairs.
And
was it Californian?
And we are the world. Ethiopia had a population of 45 million. Today, Ethiopia has a population of 90 million, and by 2050, it will have a population of 235 million. I've given you the Nigeria numbers, along with a huge move to urbanization, which doesn't seem to be impacting as we hoped it would. A country I was associated with, Niger, will increase its population by 269% over the next 40 years. And it cannot feed itself today. The 19 million people today, who will become 56 million, are 65% food deficient. This is the country most affected by global warming as the Sahara sweeps southward. We're doing nothing about it because most Western governments won't touch it.
I would argue for a degree of fairness in this one. Hang on, this is very important.
But I have the solution.
You have the solution, which to shut me up, I think, probably. No, but the point is that this is really important. Poor people are blamed enough. It's important not to victimize poor people for the sexual incontinence at the same time. You know, it's really important that this population debate is, and the whole development and the debate is not reduced down to basically numbers of children. One could argue, Bob, that 10 Ethiopian children consume the same resources as one North American child. And arguably, therefore, something first should happen in reducing the fertility rate in North America than in Ethiopia. But we know that North Americans are aging, and they actually need migrants. So I think this whole issue is far more complicated. They're simply saying that the problem is one of overpopulation, and that's the reason to underdevelopment and so on.
Next panel will deal with
We're certainly enjoying the question. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My lecture on climate change and what to do about it, the first and highest rate of return policy is secondary education for girls. Fertility rates drop dramatically when girls of any religious persuasion have secondary education. So that's the end run we have to make. Let me ask each of my colleagues to, in 1 minute, answer the questions that I mentioned before. If Maureen hasn't answered the question satisfactorily, could you tell us how would you go about finding out, rather than imposing from the elites, how would we go about asking the intended beneficiaries what these goals should be?
I think Maureen has answered that very well, and I can simply just reinforce that by saying that this week in Waterloo is a very exciting time because in our meeting today with Jim Basili, we heard that the BlackBerry tablet has been launched.
Playbook.
Playboy.
Playbook, not Playboy, no. You're still on population.
Absolutely.
It's a very good marketing idea, though. That's
Right. It has been launched. And we are so fortunate to live in this age of in this age of being able to really connect together instantly around the world. We are now a global village. And I think, as Maureen was saying, we have an unprecedented opportunity to make the peoples of the world really belong together. And through the technology and through for example, in Africa, the bandwidth is increasing every 6 months. So basically, the rate of speed of data transmission is increasing every 6 months. This is a revolution, far in excess of any other revolutions that we've known for a very, very long time to come, which means that global governance, after all, we sit in the center for international global governance, takes on a completely new meaning in this world of the global village. Now, if we could find a way, using these technologies, using new attitudes, and thinking of these things in global terms, it is not difficult to find ways of tapping what beneficiaries are really wanting. And I think all the evidence indicates that programs which are designed with the participation of those who are intended to be the beneficiaries are by far much better programs than those designed on their behalf. So I am very optimistic. You can see I'm an optimistic person by nature, that I have no doubt that the future of development is a very positive one and very strong one, and that it will be shaped by these technologies and peoples coming together, using the latest, and enabling good, sensible policies and frameworks to be developed.
Maureen, how do we make sure the poorest people benefit?
How do we make sure the poorest people benefit? Well, probably the easiest way is by transferring money directly to them. Brazil has been hugely successful with the Bolsa Familia, which is effectively a social assistance program that does have some caveats. Children have to go to school and they have to be immunized. But that is the most effective way of dealing with the poorest people. Bernard Kouchner was pushing global social security a few years ago, and I'm very sorry that it sort of dropped off the map, because I think that we should be seriously costing that out in some countries, because one can argue the same way that remittances matter a lot, where the money goes into the hands, not necessarily of the poorest people, because it's usually families who've been able to educate someone who could go off, but I'd argue that some of those workers in the Middle East who come from Kerala are from very poor families, and there's an example of the money is going directly to them. So I think look at programs like the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, transfer the money, look for ways to transfer the money directly. That's what we do here for the poorest people.
Bob, once we agree on our framework, how are we going to get it adopted at the UN?
This is I think, Barry, quite relevant to the where is the energy question. A little aside, how will the UN deal with this?
It's got to be a little aside, Bob, because we got about 5 minutes left.
Yeah. How is the UN going to deal with this? It's sort of like saying, how come the UN rejected Canada for the Security Council? The UN didn't reject Canada, and the UN is not going to deal with this. The countries of the world are going to deal with this, and 60% of the countries of the world decided Canada didn't have what it takes to be on the Security Council. It wasn't the UN. So how are the countries going to deal with the proposals? And the answer is really damn simple. The countries are going to like the proposals to the extent that it serves their national interest. And if it doesn't serve their national interest, if they think somebody's about to impose an international security tax on them when they are bankrupt, say, or about to be bankrupt, or worried about being bankrupt, they won't like it. If it implies a whole bunch of new fiscal commitments, or indeed it impairs their ability to see to the security of their states, they won't like it. So it comes down to really one of your original questions, Barry: how ambitious are we going to be? My own reaction, and of course, Mary loves to tell me that I am a Cassandra. You may have picked that up already from what I've been saying today. I reply that Cassandra was right. Nevertheless, I think the climate 10 years ago was more propitious. There was more energy. There was more global leadership when the MDGs were promulgated 11 years ago than there are now. So I despair somewhat about the fact that we are dreaming up broader, wider, more inclusive, more imaginative, more engaging MDGs when I'm not sure that we could pass the ones we've got.
Well, just before we wrap up, do you have one sentence that our audience should go away with?
One sentence.
My one sentence would be, this is too important a subject to leave it to experts, the UN, governments, or anybody. So to shape the world that you would like to live in, or I should say you would like your grandchildren to live in, looking at the audience, then I think you must join the conversation. Otherwise, things will be done for you, in your name, and at you, and you may regret it. So this is really important for our collective future, to shape the world we live in, be part of shaping that. Otherwise, don't complain about it afterwards when you don't like what is shaped.
Bob?
I'm sorry, I can't help but think, as I heard, first of all, I agree with you. Absolutely, I agree with you. Recently, I was beating up a whole bunch of students for not voting and saying you give up your bitching rights if you don't exercise that fundamental duty. And one young lady said to me, well, I may not vote, but I tweet. Okay. Mukesh, I agree with you. I will endorse what you're saying with my sentence. This development issue is vitally important and needs support in our current circumstances.
Maureen, last word.
Yes, I agree with both of you, although I don't tweet, and I know that's probably not good. I think that if on what day of the week are we? On a Wednesday night, we have people sitting here willing to give up an entire evening to talk about 8 propositions that were meant to stimulate the world is an extraordinarily good sign. This has to keep happening, and yes, I agree with Bob. Everybody does have to go out and vote, but you just have to make sure that your vote is actually going to be for somebody, for a party that believes that international relations and development matter.
Bob, Maureen, Mukesh, thank you for participating in this. I really appreciate it, and I'd ask you in the audience to join me in applauding our panel.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you to our audience. And just before I come up on stage and deliver a final remark with some useful information that you may need before you depart, I just want to take my prerogative to put Barry on the spot because I think he's gotten off a little too easily as the moderator tonight. I happen to know he's a very smart CG fellow, and he's in mid-project, as I may have mentioned, and so this is a bit mischievous to ask Barry if he has any concluding thought because he's really using all of us in this event to further his aim, his joint project with the Red Cross. And so I'd like to ask him for either some kind of a little preview of what you've learned so far, recognizing that you still have more work to do before you conclude, or alternatively, or maybe additionally, if MDGs have been described as sort of a poster for our aspirations or our hopes, is there any kind of a method or a way that you could see to actually put some traction to MDGs from an international governance perspective? Is there an innovation at the governance level that could lend a little more weight or heft to MDGs beyond being merely aspirational?
Well, it's very mischievous of Fred. I tried to finesse this by asking my three esteemed colleagues what you should walk away with, because of course I was going to walk away with the same messages. I think I learned we've got to focus on investment. We've got to focus on implementation. We've got to bear in mind the relatively modest role that official development assistance plays relative to foreign direct investment and things like remittances, which people aren't aware of. There's things we can be doing about remittances. It costs 30–40% to ship money home to Africa or the Middle East, which is totally unfair. I think we've got to focus on some method of getting global targets, global goals, global norms, and some means of localized targets. The purpose is clear. We've got to be a little more forceful on it, is to unify people around a set of norms. And I think we should be able to do that. Even if we're working in the G20, the Chinese have 5-year plans with targets. They're quite comfortable with the whole notion of targets. At one point I was going to give you a little anecdote about worrying about the G20 taking over things. I remember, because the G20 now has put development on the agenda thanks to the Koreans. When Bob was Sherpa for the G8 at Kananaskis, they made a bunch of decisions about Africa. And it involved instructions or desired movement by all of the various international institutions, including our executive directors at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank in Washington. And Bob, as the Prime Minister's personal representative in G8 Sherpa, wrote a letter to our representative in Washington telling him what was decided in Kananaskis and what the priorities for the World Bank should be. And the response came back from Washington, thank you, Mr. Fowler, we really appreciate input from the public. It's true, right? So don't worry too much about the G20. We've got to work on the particular institutions. I think other lessons are policy coherence. We got to support it, the kinds of things Maureen said in terms of individual innovations. And most important, we've got to find some way to get as Mukesh wants to do, is exploit modern technology to try and get the voices of the intended beneficiaries. And we'll work on that.
Thank you. And we're still 5 minutes ahead, so thank you very much. Thank you, Barry, Maureen, Robert, and Mukesh. We greatly appreciate your insights tonight. A very good panel discussion. Love the interactivity and the sharing of opinions. Just a few brief notes for our audience before we adjourn. The video from tonight's live webcast will be edited and posted to CG's website in our online video archive. Also, if you wish to sign up for CG's regular newsletter, CG Worldwide, it's sent by email quarterly. Our volunteers are available to help you sign up at the back of the room. Once again, I thank our public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. And finally, please mark your calendars for our next two public events. On May 18th, our topic is Politics and Peace Building, Testing a New Approach to Egypt. That's featuring guest speaker Ben Rosewell, a Canadian diplomat and our nation's representative in Kandahar in 2009 and 10. And then on Tuesday, May 31st, our topic is Groupthink and Overconfidence, Predictive Failures in the Global Economic Crisis. Our special guest is Ruben Lamdani of the International Monetary Fund, whose recent report criticized his own organization's role in the financial crisis. And joining him that evening in the discussion will be U of T professor and economist Lou Pawley, as well as CG Distinguished Fellow Paul Jenkins acting as moderator. So all the details of these events are on the CG website, and you can register there to attend. Thank you once again for coming to CG tonight, and have a safe journey home. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CG. Tonight is the latest in our regular series of public events, the CG Signature Lecture Series. I'd like to thank CG's public lecture sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for your continuing support. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming out tonight. We had about double this number registered, but I think the thunder showers may have frightened a few people away. But thank you for coming, and thank you to our online webcast audience. Besides the audience here, we do have a global audience watching via the internet. Following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones on either side, or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our panel. Our topic tonight is Beyond 2015, Development Goals for the World. In just a few moments, our moderator will introduce our highly esteemed panel. But first, I'll introduce our moderator, and that is Barry Caron, a senior fellow at CG since 2009. Barry has a distinguished career both as an academic and a policy practitioner. With a PhD in economics from Brown University, Barry joined the Treasury Board of Canada in 1971, and aside from a small detour through academia, held various positions in the Federal Civil Service over the next 3 decades, including Assistant Deputy Minister in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and in the mid-1990s holding responsibility for Canadian trade policy, including oversight of challenging international negotiations. Barry's also served as a member of the Executive Committee of the OECD and as the High Commissioner of Canada to Singapore. Today, Barry is an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria, and at CG, he's currently co-directing a joint initiative between CG and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. The goal of this project is to explore and recommend future directions for international development beyond the 2015 Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, which, as I mentioned, is our topic for tonight. And so, Barry.
The countries of the world couldn't agree that they had to be there. So it is an exercise of diplomacy, and it's an exercise worse of the United Nations. It's an exercise in the art of the possible. And therefore, that is what we could get. A big discussion, I guess, for us this evening is as we contemplate the world after 2015, and we talk about either replacing or updating the MDGs, are we likely to get more or less than we did in the year 2000? Is the world more ready to compromise or less? I fear less, and I'm bleeding into your subsequent 2 questions here. I'm not an MDG expert, I'm not a development expert. Maureen and Mukesh are, and I very much look forward to their much more intelligent analysis of what the MDGs are and are not. I find the MDGs vitally important to explain the development business. Development is under a lot of attack these days. As the financial crisis bites, as treasuries are looking for ways to save money, as militaries and foreign ministries are wanting to concentrate available resources to accomplish their geostrategic aims, development tends to get caught in the middle and suffer. So the MDGs help defend the development vocation, and I think that is vital. And I also believe it is extremely important and timely that we get good at defending the development vocation. I have some particular concerns. My concerns are squeaking wheelism. My concerns are that the securocrats will always have a more timely argument for investment in whatever concerns them. I'm worried that failing and failed states will attract the grease, despite the fact that the amount of grease available is not nearly enough to solve the problem in those failing states. I'm worried that in the era of instant gratification, of the 24-hour news cycle, the humanitarian crisis will trump development every time. And therefore, that the very limited amount of money available for real development will be sacrificed to one or other of those more immediate, more dramatic demands. Why don't I leave it there?
Okay. So Maureen, same three questions.
Well, I certainly, first thing I would do would be to change the development goals to global goals. I really think it's important that we include both poor people in the so-called North as well as people in developing countries. I think they are extraordinarily important because they set out what the desired outcomes ought to be of the whole range of social and economic and trade and foreign policy decisions that get made. So it's not just that they're goals, that I see them as the outcomes against which we ought to be judging all of the other policies. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with the current goals, or in my language, the preferred outcomes. The difficulty is in their implementation and also understanding that we should be judging the rest of what we do in terms of its ability to take us closer to the outcomes that we desire. On to the overarching framework post-2015, what should it look like? Now, I'm so literal-minded that when Barry said, imagine yourself a dictator, mind you, a kindly dictator, I may have risen too close to this challenge. So what would I do if I was a kindly dictator? Well, I would ensure, first of all, that the tax base at my disposal, the tribute from the semi-autonomous states, is first used to cost share a long-form census in each state so that they actually have the data to know how they're doing and whether their policies are leading to the better world and to greater respect that the MDGs describe. My taxes would also cost share independent think tanks in the semi-autonomous states, and indeed would cost share tertiary education, independent universities, not just primary schools.
Over to you.
Thanks, Fred. Let me remind you why we're here and how we'll use our time before I introduce the panel. We're here to discuss how should the world approach international development. You all should have a handout, a double-sided handout with basic information on the existing Millennium Development Goals, and on the back of it, there's some status of the progress. And what we're going to talk about is what should succeed those Millennium Development Goals. If you paid attention, we had a looping PowerPoint up top that gave some questions on the existing status of these goals, and I hope you did well on the test. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to begin by asking each panelist 3 questions. I'm going to ask them to respond individually in a one-sentence answer as to whether or not development goals are important. I'm going to ask them to respond in one sentence what, if anything, is wrong with the existing Millennium Development Goals. And then third, I'm going to ask them to each take a few minutes to give us a big picture answer on the assumption that we have a unitary world government. It's a world government of a world federal state, and he or she is the beneficent dictator. They can impose whatever goals they like. they can impose the development goals for the world. What would they do with respect to goals, targets, and indicators? Then we'll take about 30 minutes to explore their answers, and we'll follow with questions and discussions from the floor and with the web-based audience. So we're fortunate today to have a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel. Robert Fowler on the far right is Senior Fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He had a 38-year public service career. He was foreign policy advisor to 3 prime ministers, Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Turner, and Prime Minister Mulroney. He was Deputy Minister of National Defense. Bob is our longest-serving ambassador to the United Nations, longer serving than Paul Heinbecker. He represented Canada on the Security Council in 1999 and 2000. He was ambassador to Italy and the 3 Rome-based UN food agencies. And he was Sherpa for the Kananaskis G8 Summit, for which he chaired the creation of the Africa Action Plan. He was the personal representative for Africa of 3 prime ministers, Prime Minister Chrétien, Martin, and Harper. Maureen O'Neill is president of the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation. Her previous positions include president of the IDRC International Development Research Center. She was interim president of the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development. She's been president of the North-South Institute and deputy minister of citizenship for the government of Ontario. Mukesh Kapila is Undersecretary General at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva, and previously he was Special Advisor to the UN in Afghanistan and to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. He has also served as UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in the Sudan. He's had positions at the World Health Organization. He's been a Senior Policy Advisor to the World Bank. Earlier he was head of conflict and humanitarian affairs at the UK Government Department for International Development. He's also a medical doctor. So let's start with the 3 questions. Bob, in 1 sentence, are development goals important? A 1-sentence answer on what's wrong with the MDGs. And then Bob, you've finally been appointed as world dictator. What should we do?
So, Mary, you want me to do all of those?
All 3.
Okay. Well, I mean, are they important? Of course, it's important to have some kind of a blueprint for any $120 billion enterprise. So that would be my sentence. My second sentence of 1 would be, it's important that we keep such a blueprint, such a template green, that we revisit it often. But it's very important to remember that, unfortunately, I'm not a world dictator, and therefore what we have in terms of the MDGs are what the nations of the world could agree. And there are all kinds of things that aren't there that I suspect many of us would like to be there, and they're not there because